someone who hears an idea and provides thoughtful feedback, incorporates it maybe into your own thought and react intellectually, all that good stuff. Ben's here. He's put together a presentation that both serves his purpose as far as a thesis qualifying presentation that has certain kind of criteria around it, but also hopefully he put it together in such a way that will be relevant to us, both from an understanding by design perspective and from even the group of us that are moving on into the CAP stuff. And so Ben, I appreciate you coming and putting in the effort, and I'll let you introduce yourself, because I saw it on your slide, the next slide. So, good. Thanks, Ben. Give a round of applause.
Thank you guys for having me. This is a spot, if you're interested in the Prescott route, that you will be in within the next couple of years on your way to graduation. And that Aaron and the grad faculty are letting me be a part of this is really meaningful personally to me, and to be able to still be supported even though I left the grad program almost 2 years ago now is a really cool thing. I hope it's something, whether you're at UW, whether you're at Prescott, whether you don't pursue the degree afterwards, that you take advantage of. This community is pretty special. That's something that you should continue to be a part of as you go on. A couple intentions, as Aaron said, of this presentation. One, from my own perspective, I want to give you a foundation for my thesis proposal. I'm still in the proposal stage. I just submitted a rough draft. Actually, I got back a rough draft the other day. I still need to finish writing and submit an IRB, an internal review board, to approve my thesis work ethically. And in the middle of all that process, I need to do this qualifying presentation. And I'd really like to give you sort of my journey academically that's led me to the question that I want to ask, which, as you can see, is around place-based education and land ethic curriculum. The other intent here is for you also to engage in this. Please engage in this with me. If you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. If you have a comment, please let me know. And at the end of this, I'm going to tell you sort of my next steps. And my next steps, ideally, are going to involve you guys as educational leaders and course designers. My intention is to ask to take advantage of you guys as a resource, as well as other faculty and educators at TSS, including at the JC, the TLC, entire organization. Ideally, this stretches even beyond TSS. This ideally looks at field ed and place-based education as a whole, but right now we're starting at TSS. Awesome. Getting into it, what this whole thing's going to look like, starting out kind of where I come from and my personal philosophies on education as sort of my link back to the grad program. I assume that over the course of the past year, you've had to create a personal philosophy of education. I'm going to sort of give you mine, where I'm at, as well as my path map, from that first day on the tour or when everyone goes to Cayo Rock. Then I want to get into sort of my research so far, looking at the foundations of experiential education, place-based education, then getting into defining Leopold's land ethic. I'm assuming some of you have looked at some land ethic curriculum thus far. And then I want to look at how land ethic curriculum and philosophy can inform and should inform place-based education, and ultimately what this could mean for course design, TSS, as well as the foundation for my thesis question. So starting off, my path map. I was born in Illinois. I've lived everywhere from Colorado to New York to here. I'm really not from anywhere and yet everywhere. Family in Minnesota and Montana and Virginia and Washington. That being said, my grandfolks have lived here in the Valley since the late 60s. I know Jackson. I love Jackson. The big reason that I came to the grad program was because I love this place. I also grew up playing in the woods, especially around here, playing in the Tetons, going on backpacks, and I had a fly fish in Fish Creek when I was 4 years old. This place is a big part of my life. Academically, I went to a private high school in New Hampshire, Holderness School, and a private college in New York, Hamilton College, with a BA in philosophy. As I go forward as an educator and as a researcher, I think this is important to note because this is what's shaped my perceptions of education, is this private, traditional, liberal arts education, specifically in the Northeast. I think it's shaped who I am as an educator, as well as shaped my biases as a researcher. And it's been really fun to engage in something like Prescott, which is none of those things. It's been a struggle for me in a lot of ways. I'm so used to that formal classroom setting. To not be in that has been hard, but it's been a fun challenge. Things I've done since then, I've thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail, I've taught skiing, I've ski patrolled, raft guided in Colorado, I taught English in China, After teaching English in China, it was kind of my spur, like, all right, I'm ready to teach. That's kind of what I'm into. And that's what got me into the grad program. I found out, I'd known about the grad program for a while, but I actually applied in about the middle of July, preceding the grad program itself. And in the space of about 2 weeks, I applied, got accepted, and moved to Jackson Hole. It was kind of whirlwind. It's also defined a lot of my experiences through life, getting into things that way. I'm still here at TSS. I'm currently an instructor at the JC. I've kind of taught everything for them right now. I'm teaching the program Pura Vida, which is local high school Latinos in Jackson Hole, connecting them to leadership in places in this valley. I've also facility hosted here for Josh, taught bear trainings. I've had many memorable bear trainings right in this room. Never exploded a bear canister inside.
We share that too.
Oh, good.
This year.
Also, don't do it on the corner. Right?
Yeah. All that.
Yeah.
And I love this community. I love being here. I love being involved with it. And I'm hoping to continue doing so. This leads into, for me, the personal biases. As I go forward in research, and as you guys go forward in research, you'll find that almost every class you take makes you talk about your biases, how your biases influence your research. What lens do you look through when you look at academic papers, when you look at academic data and research? Those things that factor into it and that you wouldn't think it. Middle class for me, white upbringing, Western philosophies, private school education, traditional small schools, small class sizes. That being said, I've had exposure to a lot of the world via media, via travel. I've seen the world, however, through my lens of being this middle class white dude. I spent my entire life playing in the woods. Because of all these things, I have deep values for wild nature, for playing in wild nature. It's something that's important to me in person. It's something that's important to me to share with people. It's a big reason why I came to TSS in particular was I can teach outside in this really wild, really incredible place. I'm an introvert. I'm also a spontaneous motivator in that no-dose thing, right? And I identify myself more and more as a teacher and an educator. When someone asks, what do I do or who am I? I say, I'm a teacher. That's what I do now in whatever capacity that is. Even when I'm out rock climbing and playing in the mountains, I tend to be doing it more and more as someone who's teaching people around me about those places. Being here now for 3 years as involved in TSS and learning about it, which is cool because that knowledge gives you power, right? When you know what tree that is, it's kind of empowering, it's engaging. It's why we teach students about it. And I felt the same thing. And in doing that, I found that I want to share that information with people. So these are the lenses that I'm looking at my research through. My values of nature, playing in nature, have led me towards research in the fields and in the veins that I'm going to talk about. And my personal philosophy of education, the things that I believe about education. There's a lot more to it than this, but this is what leads to it. First, I believe that education is not a means to an end, nor an end in itself. John Dewey suggests that an experience is only educative if it leads to more growth and learning. Essentially, education is a spiral, right? It leads to itself and it builds on itself. It's not an end in itself, and it doesn't lead to a specific end. Dewey suggests that education is only educative if it leads to more education. There's a lot of education words in there. I believe that education is and should be intentional. Students need to want and intend to learn. I believe that all students can learn. What this means is that not all students learn the same, not all students want to learn the same thing. So as educators, I believe that a good educator creates engagement and ownership in students via content that is based on the student's interests, as well as profound and connected experiences. So ultimately, a student needs to be engaged via the student him or herself, not via the teacher's desire for engagement. I believe that feelings and values for a place are created through experience and knowledge of a place. And I believe in the ability of place-based and experiential ed to create profound learning experiences for learners of all ages. Through the next 20-25 minutes, I want to try and justify to you guys why I believe these things. I'm also, through that justification, going to try and provide a framework for my thesis question and my work going forward. Before I get into that, any questions or anything anyone has? Thoughts or comments thus far before I dive into the actual research? Sweet. So at this point, I want to dive into sort of the basis and history of experiential ed. This is going to be kind of a skimming over of a lot of the content. There's a lot more to it than this, right? There's a lot more to it. Because if you're talking about experiential education, ultimately you're talking about any sort of epistemology, any sort of learning or knowledge via experience. There's entire Western Eastern philosophies concerned on epistemology and empiricism. Experiential education is defined as a philosophy that informs many methodologies in which educators purposefully engage with learners in direct experience and focused reflection in order to increase knowledge, develop skills, clarify values, and develop people's capacity to contribute to their communities. The important part here is purposefully engage with learners in direct experience, right? Purposefully engage with learners in direct experience. Ultimately, experiential education is that intention and that engagement in an experience, intentional engagement in an experience. This philosophy of engaging in experience can be traced back all the way back to Plato and Socrates, through empiricism, through learning, through creating knowledge via experience. Ultimately, the study of knowledge is called epistemology. And we're going to start right now talking a little bit about Plato and the allegory of the cave. The idea that our knowledge of the world is based on our experience of the world, or our perception of the world is based on our experience of it. Does anyone know the allegory of the cave? I'm assuming folks do. Ben, do you know a quick synopsis?
The idea is kind of a thought experiment. There's a person who's chained in a cave, looking at the cave wall, and all they see is not reality that's going on behind them, but the shadows that people that are walking around outside the cave mouth project onto the cave wall. All they're seeing for their entire life are those shadows, and those shadows are their reality.
Exactly. That reality is shaped by our experience and only by our experience. And this is Plato, this is the allegory of the cave. This idea that our reality might necessarily be what's actually there, it flows from here all the way up through Descartes, through that Cartesian philosophy, right up to the Matrix, right? This is the exact scene that inspired the movie The Matrix, that there's like a grand deceiver that shapes our reality. And we only know our reality based on our experience of it. So if we're just machines plugged in the back of the head experiencing something crazy, that's all we know. We don't know our actual reality. We only know our perception, our experience of it. So ultimately, experiential education is dating back to these early ideas of epistemology, that we learn what we know via our experience of it. Ultimately, this leads to Descartes, the father of modern Western philosophical thought, in rationalists versus empiricists. Rationalists, of whom Descartes was one, interestingly, argue that our experience of the world is shaped via our mind's ability to rationalize it, that our mind has an innate knowledge in it that then shapes our perception, that shapes our knowledge. For Descartes, this meant God. This meant this innate knowledge of the perfection of God. And within that ability to know God, I think, therefore I am, the ability to rationalize comes out of that, and you have knowledge via the human mind's ability to make reasoned decisions. This is a priori knowledge, knowledge that's in the mind prior to experience. This is versus empiricists, who argue for a posteriori knowledge, who argue that the mind is a blank slate, right? Tabula rasa. This is John Locke. And all our knowledge and all our perceptions come via only our experience, that the mind is nothing prior to our experience of the world. Ultimately, modern conceptions of epistemology, and John Dewey in particular, allow for some combination of both. He accepted the ability of the mind to reason, and it was the job of the mind, through scientific method and reason, to make sense of the experiences of the physical world. I want to note right now that we just went over about 2,500 years of Western philosophy talking about 3 or 4 different people. There's a lot more to it than this, right? This is the general trajectory. We've come up to Dewey, we've come up to the early 1900s in only about 5 minutes, pretty quick. But we went to the father of modern Western philosophy, and from there you're looking at the father of modern experiential education. Dewey defined education, and at this point it's worth noting that we're moving away from epistemology and philosophy towards education itself. From just knowing how we know things to actually how we learn, into education. Dewey defined education as growth. Right? He defined it as growth, as moving up, as that spiral is building on itself. As you get into reading experience in education, have you guys read some of that yet? First chapter, traditional progressive education. One of the first chapters he talks about is this idea of traditional versus progressive education. Traditional education being specific areas of study, math, science, so on. Traditional classrooms, direct instruction, lectures. In his time versus progressive education versus not that, essentially. He argues that many people in progressive education argue that less for modern ideas of education, more just for not traditional education. For these either ors, for it has to be one or the other. Dewey argues that neither one is the answer. It shouldn't be about either ors. It shouldn't be about one or the other. It should be about finding the right way, the most effective way, the best way to educate. And he argues that education based on experience is the answer. That that's the correct way. That that's the most efficacious way to educate. 2 criteria for education based on experience. 1, continuity of educative experiences. So that these educative experiences, in our case, it's activities, right? It's our teaching activities that we use to create a point. That there's continuity, that they relate to each other, that they build on each other, that they're not isolated experiences sitting there all on their own, that they have continuity. And this is a basic idea, right? Especially as we get into understanding by design, backwards design. You're creating an experience that reflects back to the big why. And each individual activity is based on your grand objectives. That's why you start with that objective first, and those activities are based on it so that there is continuity through those experiences. The second criteria for an educative experience is interaction. And the idea that there's 2 pieces. They're not one piece, right? In traditional education, there's one piece. There's the study matter. And each student interacts and is taught the study matter. And that's it. But that study matter is static and the students get it. In the idea of interaction, there's 2 pieces. There's the student and the matter of study. There's the student and the physical world. And a good teacher, good educators can create experiences that allow for both of those. That each individual, each student is different, right? We talked about this a lot in the grad program, that people learn in different ways, and we have to differentiate and find the best way. When we're doing that, we're solving for interaction. We're saying, okay, this student learns this way, and is conducive to these experiences, so I'm taking into account both the way the student learns and the physical world itself. What is a student inclined to in the physical world, and how's the physical world support that student's interests? That there's interaction between those 2 things. So these 2 criteria, continuity and interaction, are needed for an education based on experience. Dewey's a pretty cool guy. Getting into more of his philosophy after the grad program, he's kind of become a little personal here in terms of his philosophy and the way he thought about the world, as well as education. However, within experience and education, that's in this sort of preeminent book, a critique that I have, and that many people have, is that he offers his theory and philosophy, but little in the way of actual concrete practices. And saying, all right, this is what you can do, and this is the next step, and this is how you can do things. That being said, that's perhaps the point, right? That specific activities shouldn't be defined until you have your why, until you have your objective. Because until you have your objective, you can't define how the students can interact with those things. So maybe that's the point. Yeah, he doesn't give us a lot of concrete, but he does allow for us to interact with the subject matter and interact with students. Ultimately, we've come up through all this history of epistemology and experiential ed, and we end kind of on this model, the modern experiential learning model. It's worth noting too that there's many models for the model of experiential learning, modern experiential learning cycle. This is an often one used though, and I think one we've used here. I don't know if you guys can read this. I can barely read it. At the top of our experience, right, we have a concrete experience. We experience this one thing. This is what we do with our kids. The next bit is that reflective observation. It's sitting back and thinking about it and reflecting. Okay, what happened? What went on? This bottom bit is our abstract conceptualization, thinking about, okay, kind of what can we take from that? What's next? How do we apply it going forward? And this last bit over here, active experimentation, actually applying those steps. We go through this cycle with our kids, right? We have an experience, say an initiative. We debrief it. We say, okay, what worked? What didn't work? And we say, okay, how can we apply it going forward? And then we have another experience, and we apply those things. This is the model that we're effectively taught to use at TSS, whether you're at the Jackson campus or you're in the grad program, or even sometimes in lab. So that's kind of the very, very general history of experiential education, where it comes from philosophically and epistemologically, all the way up to the modern conception kind of experiential education. In the past century, a lot of experiential ed has been associated with outdoor ed, right? With adventure education, with Kurt Hahn and Outbound and Knowles. And it hasn't been kicked out of the classroom because we still learn via experience in the classroom. But the ideas, this learning model, hasn't been incorporated in the classroom in schools that are focused on standards-based testing, in schools that are focused on, all right, we need to produce these incredible students that are going to go to Harvard and they're going to crush the SATs. That this model isn't seen as efficient. There's been changes, right? Within TSS, we've talked about being a leader in place-based education. That being said, a lot of students who come to TSS are still seeing this program as an alternative program, as something that isn't traditional schooling. So there's not an imbalance, but potentially misconceptions of what experiential learning is, especially within modern public classroom. I'm going to move on to place-based education, because this is kind of the next step after experiential ed, right? Place-based education, mainly defined by Sobel coming out of Antioch. Sobel identified a problem, a gap between the classroom and the ecological and social place in which students live, that those two things were disconnected, that you can have a student in a classroom who's learning about flowers in South America, and yet right outside the room has no idea that phlox are growing or that spring beeches are growing. And they don't even discover that those things exist until they're 29 years old and they come to a graduate program. Right? That's my experience. I grew up in this place a lot, and I didn't know so many of these things until I came here and actually engaged in this place scientifically. Or geology, kids live, at Teton High or anywhere, in northern New Hampshire. They're learning about geology via textbook, and that textbook is teaching geology in the Grand Canyon. And yet, right here, as you guys know, we have the most glorious examples of faulting and rocks and young mountains and old rock, right? And young mountains, old mountains and young rock. Incredible geological examples right out our back door. But in so many places, we don't take advantage of that. So place-based education for Sobel is the answer. It's to try and create that connection between learning topics, geology, social studies, and the place around you, taking advantage of this. Place-based education is the process of using the local community and environment as a starting point to teach concepts in language arts, mathematics, social studies, science, and other subjects across the curriculum, emphasizing hands-on, real-world learning and experiences. I hope that sounds really familiar to our definition of experiential education. The two are inexorably linked. All right? Real-world learning experiences, or in the experiential education definition, engaging in an experience. Place-based education, therefore, has roots in experiential education and often uses experiential techniques. Maybe not always. I think there's still room for lecture or direct instruction within place-based education. That being said, maybe there's room for that within experiential ed. Remember, Dewey didn't say that direct instruction isn't allowed. There's no ors, there's no concrete. There's how do you shape the experience. So potentially using experiential techniques depends on how you're going to look at experiential education, how you structure those experiences and use the experiential learning model. Teton Science Schools has a stated intention now to become the national leader in place-based education via programs such as Field Ed, the grad program, and the TLC. This is something that Leslie is immersed in right now, right up to our eyeballs. We bring students from all over Wyoming, all over the country, to immerse them in this place, to learn concepts, that ideally they take those concepts that they learned here and then they apply them back home. This is an interesting model of place-based education because we bring them from somewhere else, teach them about place here, but then we send them back home. We're not actually teaching about their home place. It's an interesting model of place-based education. I think it's something that I personally struggle with. How do you create that transference such that it still applies to their place? That being said, we're striving for place-based techniques. Point to be made here is when I've talked around, we have justifications for why we teach that way, right? There is evidence that suggests that place-based education is effective. However, thus far, we have nothing at TSS that says, via data, yeah, we do place-based education in this school setting. This is ultimately where I'm heading. Before I get into that, though, something that's important to me personally is the philosophy and incorporating matters of theory and philosophy in place-based education. And so I have this question. We often teach lessons on Leopold's land ethic. Why do we do that here? What's the value? Why is that? How is that place-based? So a little background on Leopold's land ethic. People, I'm sure, have read Sandcounting Almanac, right? Preeminent wilderness literature. The guy is just the greatest. Towards the end of Sandcounting Almanac, he discusses the land ethic. Defines the land as all those things that make up the natural landscape, right? Dirt, plants, animals, in some cases humans as well. That is the land. It's essentially all that stuff, whether wild or not. He defines an ethic in two ways. One, ecologically, and this is my favorite definition of an ethic I've ever read as a philosopher who studied this in college. Ecologically, an ethic is a limitation on the freedom of action and the struggle for existence. I'm going to read that again. An ethic, ecologically, is a limitation on the freedom of action and the struggle for existence. My personal favorite teaching moment that I've had in the past 3 years was on Jackson Hole Science Expeditions, up in Yellowstone. I said this definition like 3 times, and one of the kids was like, "Oh, I get it. I know what an ethic is. It's so that other people survive and me." Yes, that's it! This is my favorite definition as a teacher as well as a philosopher. There's another definition, though, that Leopold brings in that's essential. An ethic, philosophically or socially, is a differentiation of social and antisocial conduct. A differentiation of social and antisocial conduct. That conduct which is allowed socially and that which is not allowed socially. Whether it's morally right or wrong, he's not even saying here. He's saying simply conduct that is allowed socially and conduct that is not allowed socially. That we define our conduct almost irregardless of morality. These are two definitions, however, of one thing. The thing has its origins in the tendency of interdependent individuals or groups to evolve modes of cooperation. Within TSS, right, we're talking about interdependence and systems thinking and how different parts of systems are interdependent on each other. It's the same way within a human system, right? We're interdependent individuals, we evolve modes of cooperation. Those modes of social versus antisocial conduct are those things that we limit in the face of continued existence. Thus far, Leopold argues that ethics have been defined by and within our social community of humans, that they include us, but not those trees, not that land, not that fish. He argues within the land ethic to simply enlarge the boundaries of the community to include the land. That we enlarge the boundaries of our social community to include all that stuff. If we do that, what are the next steps? How do we value those things? Do we place monetary values on those things? Do we place personal values on those things? What are the next steps? Leopold himself notes then that the most serious obstacle impeding the evolution of our land ethic is the fact that our education system is headed away from, rather than toward, an intense consciousness of the land. That our education and economic system is headed away from, rather than toward, an intense consciousness of the land. Place-based ed seems intended to create a solution to this exact problem, to create an awareness and a consciousness of the land. So it seems to me, in my thinking, that the land ethic and place-based education are inexorably linked, that one needs to go with the other. However, there is little to no literature thus far that I've read, and from people that I've talked to, that expressly includes the land ethic into place-based ed. There's lots of place-based ed lots of land ethic curriculum, including the Leopold Foundation, including here, that have used place-based ed to teach the land ethic. But the land ethic itself isn't included in the actual foundation of place-based ed. There are people that have talked about one and two the same, particularly this guy, Gruenveld, who's now Greenwood. I can never totally figure out what his last name is at the moment. But Sobel doesn't address it, and a lot of other place-based philosophers and theorists haven't addressed the link. To create a little more of a need why we need value and experience. Jack Turner, who's a local guy, local author, really, really cool guy. His book, Abstract Wild, is, for me, mind-blowing in how he thinks about nature. Within it, he states that we treat the natural world according to our experience of it, and we only value what we know and love. So we treat the natural world according to our experience of it. Part of the reason that I'm at TSS is because I believe in the profundity of outdoor experiences. I love the woods because I had incredible experiences in them. At camp, with my family, by myself. My love for this place, my value is based on my positive experience with it. I want to share that with kids. I imagine that's a reason why you guys are here as well. We also only value what we know and love, right? We don't value something, we don't love it if we haven't had experience with it. Therefore, our value, our ethic of the land is dependent on our experiences with it. Therefore, a need for experiential and place-based education to create positive, profound experiences that will lead to values. Whether good or bad, values will be created. Right? Within a lot of these land ethic curriculums, we're not telling kids that they have to value the land in a certain way. We're getting them to create a value, whatever that value is. One of the better experiences, again, during Jackson Hole Science Expeditions, we had a full lesson on the land ethic. At the end, the kids produced work, whether via kind of Andy Goldsworthy or via written product about their personal values. And there were certainly kids who felt totally free to express, well, I believe in some preservation, but the fact is I believe that the land is a resource and I think we need to use it to live. Right? They feel free to express that value. We're not trying to tell them to value the land in the preservation or conservation, but even though that's kind of what we're going for. But in creating that value, you're creating ownership, you're creating engagement, and then students are engaged, and you're accounting for that continuity, and you're accounting for that interaction of experiences. Gruenwald, right, Greenwood, in order to develop an intense consciousness of places that can lead to ecological understanding, place-based educators insist that teachers and children must regularly spend time out of doors, building long-term relationships with familiar and everyday places. He's directly referencing the land ethic in this quote. He's the only person I found who actually references both, who says that we build values through our experience, and values are a necessary part of going forward. Engaging in the land ethic itself gives values to our places via experience and reflection in those places. The combination of experiential ed, place-based ed, and land ethic curriculum. Let's connect some of the dots. We talked about experiential education, how that kind of leads into place-based education, the continuity of experiences, the interaction between student and place that both have value. The place-based education, of course, is based on experience of a place and the value of a place. Most importantly, the value, the ethic of a place is based on our experience with it. That we're going to create these social ethics based on individual and communal experience of a place. The land ethic and land ethic philosophy can inform place-based ed. We don't simply engage in a place by learning about it, we engage by valuing it. Or perhaps we value it via engagement. There's links there, and those links, I believe, in students will create ownership. This is at the point where I'm starting to leave my lit review, my written research, and I want to start creating my own research. How can I include Leopold's land ethic into our conception of place-based education? How can the land ethic inform our conception of place-based education? And if it informs our conception of place-based education, how does it inform course design at Teton Science Schools? How does it inform how you create a course using backwards design, using UVD, when you're planning for courses for the summer, when you're planning for courses 10 years from now, when you're off doing your own thing. So for me, working into my thesis plan now, there are 3 steps. One, I'm going to continue to examine the intersection of place-based ed and land ethic curriculum. Where do they overlap? Where can they overlap? How can one inform the other? Once I've looked at that, my ultimate goal is to create a rubric specifying parts of a course that meets land ethic informed place-based ed course design. I don't yet know what that looks like. I don't know what the specificities are. I don't know if it's conceptual or if it's like every single one must have a land ethic lesson the last 22 minutes. I don't know yet. I have ideas. Once I've created that rubric though, my goal is to eventually hand this out to you guys, to other educators. Ideally this summer, if you're willing to do this with me, I would love to volunteer you, to ask you to be a part of it, to ask you to be a part of my grad research. So ultimately, you're doing this on 2 ends, right? You're helping me out, but you're also continuing to engage in Teton Science School's graduate level research. If you guys are willing to do that and engage with this rubric that I create, and to create your course, and to evaluate your course via this rubric, I collect data, Teton Science Schools collects data, we can reevaluate the rubric itself. We can say maybe at this point that yeah, Teton Science Schools does do place-based ed, or does do land ethic informed place-based ed, or maybe we're going to say no, it doesn't. Oh crap, we have to reevaluate. But ultimately, that's the goal. That by the end of the summer, by having you guys help me out, by having educators over the Jackson campus, including faculty and staff and instructors help me out. Ultimately, we're informing place-based ed. We're informing Teton Science Schools. You guys are taking part in a study that might inform your studies down the line. It's also just cool, I think. Going forward, again, I'll be trying to hand this out this summer. I'll be ideally collecting both quantitative and qualitative forms of data from educators across the organization. Ultimately, down the line, maybe in one of your master's theses or in my own doctorate research, we continue this and we expand it beyond TSS, right? And we say, okay, if we're going to be a national leader, that means handing out this information to other organizations, public schools, other private institutions, whatever it looks like. I would love going forward to get feedback from you guys, if you're willing to be involved with this. I would love for you to take this rubric that hopefully I'll create this summer and use it and give me feedback on it. And ultimately, for your own personal benefit, I do believe that this can inform how you design courses using backwards design, using understanding by design. I do believe it'll be relevant, maybe not in every case, maybe not in every individual, right? There's that interaction, even if you're just not into it, and I think that's more than valid. If you are into it, I again, would love the support and would love the feedback and involvement. That's kind of the end of the presentation. References, a bunch. If you guys are interested in any of these books or references, let me know. Also, if you're interested in any further land ethic or land value curriculum, I have a lot right now. I also have resources to find more, including all the Leopold Foundation. If you're interested in that, please come find me. I will definitely make that available for folks who are into it. I've created things, everything from Leopold and Will Cronin on the Trouble with Wilderness, as well as basic things that we do here at TSS, right? We're going to lead the LORAX. How are we going to be? So if you're interested in these resources or those resources, please come ask me. Other than that, thank you guys for your time. Any questions, any thoughts? I would love to hear some feedback going forward.
Give him a round of applause. So this is our opportunity just to inform him, to share in a conversation, to think a little bit about our practice. And so, what are your actions? What are your thoughts, comments, questions for Ben? I'm sure he'd really love to hear your thoughts at this point.
What does the land ethic curriculum look like? And what are your objectives in the land ethic curriculum?
For me, it's to engage kids in a value of the place, right? And so you've had this experience. Well, what does that experience mean to you about this place now? And so from ages 5th grade through undergrad, it's thinking about your experience, whether science content or otherwise, in a different way, right? It means, okay, if I feel engaged, do I actually value this place now? What is that value? And that can be as specific as, I had kids who are, argue like, I think that 50% of the land should be developed and 50% of the land should be set aside for preservation. It can be as general as a story or a student last summer who was from China who created a song about the pollution. Do you remember what Chu's song was? It was about the value of wildlands in her culture versus the value of wildlands in Western culture. And it was expressive and it examined those differences. And for me, there's value in that because those experiences led to me to value this place. But I think there's value in that for students because they're expressing their opinions, they're owning their values. They're saying, yeah, I believe this and this is wrong. I think there's value. I think there's engagement for students. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yes. Yeah.
I'm really interested the definition of the ethic as a social construction. That idea that go back maybe here. Yeah, it's this idea of differentiation of social and anti-social conduct. It's definitely a social constructed piece of knowledge, right? It's not about an individual, but yet it is about an individual. I wonder if your data collection can look broadly towards groups as much as implementation, like outcomes of a collective outcome as far as shifting of ethic holistically versus whether we do it or not. I don't know.
I think ideally it does do that.
Yeah.
I don't want to say I'm limiting my scope, but I'm limiting my scope so I can get it done.
Yeah.
I think that ideally, if TSS is going to continue to do educational research, I think that's part of it. What are the outcomes of it? How do things change? What's the before and after test? Especially, if you're looking at it as social constructions, right? We almost always create those positive learning environments where students create their socially acceptable and non-acceptable behavior beforehand. There's some links there too. And how does that change over time? What is acceptable beforehand? What is acceptable after? Both in terms of their social conduct within, say, a group, but also within their conception of what's appropriate within the land. Yeah, I think they're.
So is your question not necessarily looking at efficacy of it? It's more of whether it exists or not, whether we are doing it. Like the question, I guess. Yeah.
So I kind of have like two stakes in it. One could argue why are you even including the land ethic in this one, which is focused on place-based ed? And so that's kind of like my personal projection on it, that I think there's value in that.
Yeah.
But then also too, there's nothing out there that says like, yep, we're doing place-based ed. It seems simple. It seems like a yes or no sort of question. But I think in examining what you need for that yes or no question, you'll get into some pretty interesting stuff. I'm hoping down the line, it'd be so cool to do before and after tests with participants and with students. There's definitely you talk about science as a human endeavor. There's some restrictions there as far as what I can accomplish this stuff.
Oh yeah.
We were talking about this earlier, that are you incorporating affective objectives, looking at emotional response or deep feeling? How's that play in?
Yeah, I think necessarily it will be effective. Affective. Because I think as much as we try to define values, so much of our actions based on our values comes from feeling rather than from fact. I don't know if I'm saying that right. So that feelings, that the affect will change, I think necessarily informs what values are. And that is part of how we design courses, right? We design courses with effective goals, so I think it necessarily plays into it. Yeah. Do you have ideas for that? Do you have like ideas how it might fit in?
And we were talking about earlier, how do you assess that, how do you measure a student's feeling? I mean, other than you can talk to them
Yep.
in a conversation, or if you have, maybe you would think that like artistic expression can demonstrate, like a song,
Yep.
actually would be a really sweet way to assess whether that student has some feeling about this or that.
And I think that right there, that you can evaluate through conversation is why I'm definitely going to include and perhaps focus on qualitative forms of research instead of quantitative, so that I can use the student's voiced experience rather than them simply putting a number down on something. So I think that research methodology hopefully will allow for like that effective change to. And again, here I'm not going to be measuring the students. I'm going to be looking at the course design in particular. That being said, an affective assessment is a necessary part of course design, and I think we'll look at that. And therefore, I think should be measured via qualitative research methodologies. Yeah.
So tagging off of that, what are some of your like rough ideas for elements to put into the rubric, given that we're operating in a really affective domain?
Totally. Thought about this a lot. I honestly don't even have concrete answers yet.
Yeah.
Part of my examples are definitely going to be just the rubrics that we use here. Because you have to start with something, and that's probably where I'm going to start and then try and move on. My mentor Bob Tremblay has created similar style rubrics, but for measurement of different effective qualities. I'm forgetting off the top of my head what the program is for. But this will be interesting because this is going to be almost a rubric for a rubric. This is going to be a rubric for course design. I don't know why I keep making this. I don't know what this informs, but it feels really natural.
I thought of that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's my totally. Oh yeah. Thermometer. So I think there have to be certain elements. I mean, if we define place-based ed as being this thing, there has to be a rubric to measure it. All right. It's experiential, therefore it's based on experiential learning model. So therefore it's experience, reflective observation, what's next, contextualize, and another experience. So therefore it's within that model, which we know we do already via the 5E model, via the model of the library days. It's going to necessarily involve this place because we're doing place-based ed with students here. But since we said there's a problem there, right? We're sending these students back to a place that isn't here. There has to be an element of transference, of teaching large concepts that apply to their place as well as our place. That's such a natural motion. What I'd like to do is get more specific than that. But honestly, I'm not sure what that looks like.
Can you go back to your question? How can including Leopold's land template into our conceptual place inform course design activities?
So ideally here, the rubric does two things, right? It both lets us evaluate what we've already got, but also
I'm good with it. Just keep
Okay.
going. Yeah.
It helps us evaluate what we've already got, but it also informs where we're going.
Yeah, it's almost like that's in the broad scope. That question is great. I think if I could give you some feedback, I would say for a research-based question, I think the idea of measurability and of being able to get concrete and even narrowing your scope, I would imagine, like say if you had this populace of instructors both here at the GHC, a rubric that would be like you define what that intersection is, and then instructors evaluate their design, whether that means on a course or whether that means a daily lesson plan, on if or if not they've achieved these criteria. So in other words, what does it look like to do it well or not well, or like thinking that way. And so it's not necessarily graduate students or instructors changing their lesson of the day, which we've talked about. We don't want that.
No.
We don't want everybody to have a land ethic. I mean, maybe that we do, but at the same time, we're not pushing that.
No, that's not the intention.
Yeah, but it's more of like, take anybody's on any given day, whether you're in science posse or whether you're teaching expeditions or ENA or whatever it is, and you say, all right, did you do this, this, and this? And then with some qualitative, that could be quantitative, and then with some measure or more qualitative side of things, how well did these interfaces play out? How well, and like a kind of a couple little guiding questions. You take that, and then you got the quantitative side of thing, at least something to talk about, and then the qualitative would be incredible, and an opportunity to interview instructors. I mean, post-capstone, just say, I'm going to sit down with a grad student at the end of the capstone and say, I'd love to talk to you for half an hour. I'm going to ask you these 3 questions, and see what they come, and then see what happens. So I think narrowing your question to something around design, a priori, and then post as well. Like what they do ahead of time and what it would like after. I'm just running my mouth now, but
Totally.
something that narrows it to make it like a little more seamless integration into what we're doing.
Yeah, and that's what I've struggled with so far is it's like 2 parts. It's the combination of the land ethic with place-based ed, but then it's the specificity of evaluation of course design. And that is kind of what I'm struggling with, is like specificity. I like that. I like that.
So maybe think of it this way. Think of it as coming up with a hypothesis and then testing that hypothesis. I would hypothesize that we teach land ethic almost on a daily basis, whether we do it explicitly or not.
Yeah.
So what data could you collect to test that hypothesis? And then from that, having some anecdotal comment on its efficacy or its instructor experience or something around that would be I think a powerful comment on place-based education. And it's novel. The idea, and I'll just celebrate that, the idea of land ethic is not it's a novel idea, and it could further things. So I think you're on the right path.
I want to tag in on that, and I see potential. I was struggling with the word rubric because I think of the rubric as a tool to assess.
Metric.
Yeah. And honestly, kind of what I'm envisioning, I'm going to connect to what you all looked at yesterday. So that table from the next generation science standards, the nature of science, and so it's essentially a learning progression of looking at elementary, middle, high school, and then what are the themes of what nature of science looks like, and then how is it met at those different grade bands. And you may not go into that specificity of grade bands, but maybe it's identifying what are the key principles. One is experiences outside, another is discussion of values and different things, and then and then the sub-bullets are kind of what are specific activities that you might have in mind or might be looking for, even a step beyond that, what are the broader goals or understandings of students. I think the rubric was where I was at, but I think there's potential towards that.
Yeah, and I have a document. There's a number of them out, as far as scrutinizing curriculum, from the Understanding by Design world. There's all sorts of matrix or metrics around evaluating curriculum on scales of 1, 2, 3, based upon certain standards of design, right? So standard 1, standard 2. If you could create a list of standards of land ethic curriculum, assuming that what we're doing is place-based, or maybe I could do that as well, but say, and then this is here, and then somewhere we have some metric of whether we address those standards or not, and then thinking of that in a broad data set across Teton Science Schools, you could say, you could come up with some, I'll show you some models. Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
Rarely, but have you ever actually asked a group of students to come up with their own land ethic after the field course? I'm just curious about that.
Various short week courses. We've asked students to come up with a belief statements, like we talk about what I believe about education. similarly with Lando, like, I believe this about the land, or I value this about the land. And that, seen that expressed via just writing, seen that expressed via like Andy Goldsworthy art project of some sort, where they explain it afterwards. Jackson also has expeditions. We ended up actually presenting these out along with, what was the other high school course? I forget. But we actually combined with one of the other summer courses, and they presented their art project. It was on the, no,
ENA, yeah,
ENA.
Expressions in Art and
Expressions in Art and Art. They presented their art projects, and then we presented these land ethics. And one of them was Chu, who sang her song, which was like incredible. Others were simply writing with poems. I mean, they can take the expression of anything they want. We've evaluated them. The assessments have been interesting because when you're evaluating that, you're evaluating someone's values. And the intention wasn't to evaluate, like, oh, you don't like the land, I'll kick you in the head. The intention is to say, what's the thought you've put into it? How have you changed? What's your conception of it? And you can measure that. You can say, yeah, I can see you thought about this and via this and this and this criteria. And we were able to assess that via a variety of expressions of their language. And it worked, and I think kids got something out of it.
Have you ever asked them to do it collaboratively? Because doing like ethic is like socially acceptable and not socially acceptable.
Never done it. It's a great point.
Not necessarily an isolated category, but
Totally.
that's something that I think students have been forced to come up with together. It's not just their individual values that they account. Putting them ethic as being something that's larger than just their.
We've done it almost overtly via positive learning environment, community contracts and such. We've done that, we do that socially, absolutely. But I haven't done it with the stuff. It's a great idea.
Thinking back to the transference piece of all this, as you've gone through the program, been in TSS for a couple of years, and are now like deep into the land ethic, how has your teaching changed or evolved to work on that transference piece of like, I know you're here for this week, when you go back home, you still want you to like bring it back and focus in your own hometown, which is very different potentially from here.
Where it's changed for me is that I've become really transparent and really overt and intentional about my goals. 3 weeks ago, we had a group that was on the JSU for 5 days, and I had very, very specific goals with regards to the nature of science. And I was phenomenally upfront and explicit about those goals. And literally said, science is a human endeavor to their faces, and then said, remember that to their faces. And then had an experience that explained that, right? It wasn't just saying that, it was saying it, having experience, and then reflecting on it. But being extremely, extremely explicit about that transference. 3 weeks ago, it's actually really cool. The culture at the JC is changing a little bit for the better. Being here, we're kind of isolated from a lot of what's going on over there. You know that this is a very different place. And the culture changed over there. Aaron came over and did a nature of science presentation for all the JC instructors, and it was brilliant. Based off of that, we started doing pre and post tests on all our students regarding their knowledge of the nature of science. And we've been so explicit about that. And 3 weeks ago was the best example. We had a course at the very beginning for anything. We had students do a mind map of the nature of science. We said, okay, science is ... And they did a mind map. And it had things like science is chemistry or science is math. And things that wasn't like, well, those things, science includes some of those things, that's what science is. And then 4 days later, on the same mind map, it was, science is a human endeavor, and science is gathering of empirical data. Things like, yes, that's exactly what it is. So my teaching has become explicit, has become intentional, both with regards to science as well as land ethic. When I ask kids, okay, what do you value? And that's the fun part. There is getting kids to, it's a vulnerable position to say, I value this. It's putting yourself out there to get hurt potentially. Like we said before, we say, yeah, it's a crappy value, kick you in the head. That's a really vulnerable position, but ideally at TSS, we're building one, we're building a PLE, we're in a comfortable position at a time, you can express your values, but then also we're explicitly saying, what is it? You know, based off this information so far, tell me what you believe, if you're. So my teaching has become much more intentional and specific over the past few years. Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.